The complete story of Ruth, one of the most important women in the Bible. The story of Ruth is one of the most beautiful and profound accounts in all of Scripture. It is a story not only of loyalty, faith, and love, but also of redemption and God's providence. Though the Book of Ruth is short just for chapters, it is packed with spiritual truths and timeless lessons. Ruth was a Moabite woman who, despite being an outsider to Israel, became part of God's great redemptive plan and was honored as an ancestor of King David and, ultimately, Jesus Christ himself. The story begins in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a time of instability and frequent rebellion against God. A severe famine struck the land of Judah, and a man named Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons Mahlon and Chilion left their hometown of Bethlehem to live in the land of Moab. Moab was a foreign nation often hostile toward Israel, but desperation led them there. Tragedy soon struck. Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow. Later, her two sons married Moabite women Orpah and Ruth, but after 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. Now Naomi was left without her husband and sons, and her daughters-in-law were widows too. In the culture of that time, widowhood was a heavy burden, especially without male relatives to provide protection and support. Naomi, brokenhearted, decided to return to Bethlehem after hearing that God had once again provided food for his people. She urged Orpah and Ruth to stay in Moab, where they could remarry and rebuild their lives. Orpah wept, kissed Naomi goodbye, and stayed behind, but Ruth's response was extraordinary. She clung to Naomi and declared some of the most famous words in Scripture. "Where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried." Ruth 1:16-17. With this act of loyalty and faith, Ruth left behind her homeland, her gods, and her future in Moab to follow Naomi and the God of Israel. When Naomi and Ruth arrived in Bethlehem, the entire town was stirred by their return. But Naomi, filled with grief, said, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Yet even in her bitterness, Naomi was not abandoned. God had already set in motion a plan of redemption through Ruth's courage. To survive, Ruth went to glean in the fields, picking up leftover grain after the harvesters. This was a provision in the law of Moses for the poor and foreigners. By God's providence, Ruth happened to work in the field of Boaz, a wealthy and kind man who was also a relative of Naomi's late husband. When Boaz learned who Ruth was and heard of her loyalty to Naomi, he was deeply moved. He protected her, provided her with food and water, and instructed his workers to leave extra grain for her to gather. Ruth's reputation for faithfulness and humility spread quickly. Naomi, recognizing God's hand, saw an opportunity. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer or relative who, according to Jewish law, had the right to marry a widow to preserve the family line. Naomi instructed Ruth to approach Boaz during the threshing season in a gesture of humility and proposal. Ruth obeyed, laying at Boaz's feet, symbolically asking him to take her under his protection. Far from being scandalous, this was a righteous and courageous request rooted in Israelite custom. Boaz, touched by Ruth's loyalty and integrity, agreed to redeem her if another closer relative declined the duty. The next day, at the town gate, Boaz publicly settled the matter. The nearer relative refused, and Boaz claimed his right to marry Ruth. The people and elders of Bethlehem blessed their union, praying that Ruth would be fruitful like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel. God honored Ruth's faith. She and Boaz were married, and they had a son named Obed. Naomi, once bitter and empty, was filled with joy as she held her grandson. The women of Bethlehem praised God, declaring that Ruth was better to Naomi than 7 sons. Obed later became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, the greatest king of Israel. And from the line of David came the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The story of Ruth is remarkable because it shows how God works through ordinary people and unexpected circumstances. Ruth was a Moabite, a foreigner who had no claim to Israel's covenant promises. Yet by faith, she chose the God of Israel and became woven into his plan of salvation. Her loyalty to Naomi, her humility in labor, and her boldness in faith all point to the kind of character God honors. Ruth's story also foreshadows the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just as Boaz redeemed Ruth, Jesus is our Redeemer who takes us outsiders because of sin and brings us into his family. Ruth reminds us that God's grace